Right, so today we are going to do a summary and a recap and talk about some of the points from the Christine Armstrong episode, which was essentially really about mental health in the workplace. Could, for some, be considered a little bit of a boring topic, not that spiritual in itself compared to some other topics like breathwork, meditation, but I think it did actually get into some things that do affect us on a deep spiritual level at work. You know, most of us spend a large period of time at our jobs. And I think sometimes we look at it just from a very material perspective of this is a job that's just going to give me money to look after my family, etc. And I think sometimes people are just going through the motions versus thinking, how is this job making me feel? And even if you don't want to leave your job, how can I be more fulfilled in my job, right? So I think for me, one of the biggest takeaways I had, and we'll put a link to the study in the show notes, is Christine gave a really fascinating fact, which is that people who have the highest rates of anxiety, depression, mental health problems in the workplace are people that essentially are just going from their office to their home. So they're either in their residence or in the office place. And I've definitely seen this with some people that I know. Even myself, running a business obviously can be stressful. And what I've noticed is that there are periods where I've been the most stressed is typically where I'm in that routine, where I'm just either working from home, going to the office, going to see my family or my partner, Anna, and there's not much in between. Whereas actually when I go out, go to a concert, get into nature, meet friends, then suddenly I'm looking at things that are making me stressed and thinking, why was I so stressed about that? It was totally insignificant. So some of you may be in that routine, and I think we all get into it, especially as we get older and we're less social, of just, you know, between our house and an office. And that is going to lead to higher rates of anxiety and mental health. So if you are in that routine, get out of it, go for a walk, go for a concert, maybe get out of the city where you're living. I think that's going to be really important. But yeah, Tom, I thought I'd come to you because obviously, you know, you're living in Medellin in Colombia. You grew up in Guildford. Obviously, you've lived in London. So you've been in that rat race, as I call it, which I'm in, living in the center of London. But yeah, how do you kind of see things from the outside, looking at it all the way from Colombia now?
It's funny, I was talking to somebody last week, actually, and one of the very few things I miss about Colombia, about London, and one thing that I used to love is I was a cyclist everywhere in London, and my office used to be just off the River Thames. So every morning and every afternoon, I'd have a 45-minute cycle ride along the River Thames, and it was just kind of the perfect way to leave work and to just relieve that stress on the way home from work with exercise, fresh air, and a beautiful view. I know we're still kind of talking about going from work back to home, but when it's kind of an active physical activity with a beautiful view, it really helped me just to completely disconnect the two. I mean, now I'm in Colombia, my life's very different. It's a lot more varied. I'm working on a big natural reserve project. So I'm often outdoors. There's a whole team there. So I'm constantly now floating between different projects in so many areas. But just like you say, I do see people back home. And it was interesting during lockdown. I mean, obviously the factors were different there. So it wasn't like, we could just get up and go to concerts, and the rates of mental health and anxiety there were some studies to show them so much higher because your work life was your home life, because you would probably be maybe working in the spare bedroom, and then your commute would be a walk to the kitchen. So it's really important for me to have that passion, whether it's music, whether it's growing food, whether it's, a sport on the weekend or, in the week, just to get outside and deconnect.
I think you bring up a good point as well that, in Colombia, when you're in the middle of nature, you can kind of go for a walk, and it's almost, that's the point of doing that walk is, oh yeah, I'm in nature, it's really nice to go for this walk. But you can also mix things up in a place like London, where actually your commute can be a bike ride, or in my case, I really love walking. And even if it's an hour walk, for me, the hour walk to go into central London is amazing because I go through Hyde Park. And my colleague Lawrence, he actually lives by the beach in Nicaragua, so his setting is more fortunate than most people, but he does this thing where he does like a fake commute in his head. So he gets up, he walks along the beach for 15 minutes and then he walks back. And he actually says if he doesn't do that, even though he's actually in a really beautiful setting, he's not like leaving his house before he starts work. So that's bad in a way, and going into Christine's point about anxiety. So I think sometimes, whether you're in a beautiful setting by the beach in Nicaragua, you're in nature in Colombia like you, or you're in London, there are ways before you actually start work, not just like meditating, exercising in itself. It's like you can actually do those things on the way to work. Like you said, you can cycle, you can go in, walking, running, whatever it is. One of the other things, thinking about London in itself, was Christine, right at the start of the podcast, talked about the experience she'd had, like in the worst job she'd ever had, essentially. And she knew kind of within the first week that it wasn't the right job for her. And I asked her, you didn't trust her intuition in that case, because she stayed at the job and she didn't quit. And she was like, no, I did actually trust my intuition, but it was more like I didn't have the bravery to leave. And I feel like a lot of my friends in London, especially when I lived in Colombia, they were like, oh, it's like so brave that you went and moved to Colombia, etc. And I said, hey, it wasn't actually that brave. I had some money saved up. It was easy for me to do. But a lot of them have actually been in a similar situation where they've had a load of money saved up. They've been in these quite corporate jobs, but they're always waiting for the next thing. It's like the next promotion, etc. And then, go into that term rat race. And I think sometimes we're always waiting for the next thing versus looking at, how am I feeling at the moment in this job? Okay, I'm not that happy, right? Can I leave? Have I got money saved up? And often the answer is yes, but people decide not to do that, which I've found strange. And often the intuition is very important there. That's obviously what Christine Armstrong was talking about, was that intuition, if she trusted her gut. And then what was very interesting was actually people gave her advice, but really from the outside of, no, don't leave the job. But because they were more looking at it from like a tick box exercise, you've only been in this job for 2 weeks, so it's going to look really bad on your CV if you leave. But you need to put yourself first in these situations. You need to put your own mental health, all these things. So it's very interesting that she was actually getting that advice. You need to think about yourself in these situations. So if you imagine you're Christine and look at yourself and say, am I like Christine in my job at the moment? Do I actually like this? Or am I just going through the motions and like waiting for the next promotion or money or whatever it is? Because I do feel, especially in big cities like where I'm living in London, people are doing that. And there's actually a lot more opportunities than they think, but they feel very closed in their own world. And yeah, Tom, I don't know if you've ever seen that with any of your friends.
Yeah, for sure. And I felt it myself when I was also in London, worrying about also the job title's another one. You have to get that next promotion, get that next pay rise, get that next thing. And when I have that thing, then this will happen, and then I'll leave the job. And I stayed in that for a while myself. Now I'm obviously living a pretty, I guess, a very different life to all of that. And, I think a lot of that's because I learned those lessons. But I know people back in London who say exactly the same thing to me as you. You're so lucky. And, I know I have some fortune in some areas with where I've been brought up, but actually most of the people who are telling me I'm lucky or I'm brave, they have the same possibility to make the changes that I made that they could. And yeah, I think it's just partly a courage thing, partly a confidence thing. And partly it is that rat race. They don't want to, if you go away and maybe leave that big corporate job of yours, then where are you going to be when what's next? Where do you come back to? And maybe your colleague who you're trying to get that promotion against, well, you've fallen one step down the ladder. But for some people, it's I'm not against the corporate job. Many people I know who love what they're doing, and really, they have that ambition to be the CEO, the managing director. And if that's really your passion, fantastic. But I think there's that quote, you've got to make sure your ladder's climbing up the right wall. So when you get to the top, well, you never quite get there, but at least you're always going in the right direction. But many people's ladders are are going to completely the wrong place.
Yeah, 100%. It's funny, isn't it, that sometimes the people that are like, oh, you're so lucky, they're actually in a place of privilege as well. And they don't realize it, right? They're kind of stuck in their own ways. I wanted to, obviously, we talked about Christine from a sense of, when you're in a job you don't like, and it's actually much easier to get out than you think. You're putting these barriers in your head. But then I also wanted to talk about if you are happy in your job, like I was, obviously you're doing something you really like, so am I at the moment. But naturally we're going to have stresses, whether it's with staff, whether it's with, clients, whether it's with technology, whether it's with working hours, whatever it is, all of us are going to face stresses, right? So taking this outside the context of being unhappy in your job, whatever job you're doing, how can you live in a bit more of like a Zen way? And the thing Christine talked about was micro stresses, which I actually thought was very interesting. And she was talking about things like the way someone speaks to you. And I guess when she was talking about these micro stresses, it almost sounded like they're things we create in our heads in a way, like someone's tone of voice. That's how you're interpreting it. It's just the way they speak, right? And what she was saying is never reacting in a negative way to them, because that's obviously just going to make them feel more negative. And even if it's not a micro stress, it's a big stress. If someone is shouting at you and you shout back at them, it's just going to kind of escalate. So she actually, I think the advice she was trying to give, if someone's coming to you with energy, and there's a guy called David Hawkins, and he's got this, we can put it in the show notes as well, this kind of hierarchy of emotions. But essentially, if you're coming at someone with anger, often they're going to come at you with anger and resentment and all these things. Whereas actually, if you come at them with a place of love and say, oh, it seems like you're angry, you're kind of like, what's going on? You're going to have a much better conversation with them, because I think often these emotions escalate. And sometimes we can be the bigger person in these situations and not react the same way people are kind of reacting to us. But yeah, I know obviously you're not in the corporate lifestyle, as you said, Tom, but I imagine you're building this retreat where you are working with staff, and I imagine you still go through the same stresses that all of us go through.
Yeah, exactly the same. And it's actually, we're employing around 15 different people, and there are problems every day. And anyone running a business knows rarely you get a message being like, hey Tom, great news, this incredible thing's just happened. It's usually, this is broken, there's this problem, there's this, that. And exactly as you're saying, there's that kind of fine line between not just sitting back and letting these things slide, and where is that yin and yang line, versus actually sometimes you do have to push back. But the thing I found interesting with Christine is there are some small things, my interpretation of anything, that you can just let slide in a kind of more mature way. If somebody's, getting annoyed that you're not responding, instead of just responding back with, well, I was busy, what are you doing? Like, why are you having a go at me? Just let it slide and respond. And then instead of in the moment where there's the tension, you don't want just to let people walk all over you or anything, then actually later that day when you're face to face, sit down and have a proper conversation. Like, look, especially if it's a bigger thing, look, this X, Y, Z happened. It made me feel like this. I don't think this is on or respectable. Yeah. And then you kind of just ease that tension. And there's always two sides to every story, and usually, that's the way to go about it. I mean, rarely discussions in SMS and WhatsApp rarely lead to productive solutions. So
yeah. Well, that's that thing about tonality, right? There's no tonality on those platforms. And I mean, nowadays you don't know if you're sending those messages, it could be a robot sending them as well. So just even showing you're human. But yeah, I think that's probably I think a great way to wrap up this summary, which is, again, it all comes down to communication. So I think I really like what you said, Tom, and Christine said this on the show as well, is if you got a problem, don't sweep it under the carpet, but have a conversation. Obviously, if you're lucky enough to work with someone like in person, just have a sit down, like have a drink, talk to them. And obviously if it's in a remote environment, the best thing is a call or a Zoom call like we're doing here, versus, like you said, texting, etc. So you don't want to pretend the problem doesn't exist. You need to address the problem, but again, it's about doing it in a calm manner, so not shouting and just saying, hey, I've noticed this recently, like, what are you doing to work on it, etc. So it's all about the way, the tonality, the emotion that you're bringing to the problem, and communicating in a very clear manner. So those are Tom and I's takeaways from the Christine Armstrong episode. If you got any other takeaways, feel free to leave them in the comments. As always, subscribe to us on YouTube and across all the podcast platforms, and we'll chat to you next week.